afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for participating. We are going to start slowly as we still are seeing people join in. I want to thank everyone to our first webinar in our series on the future of agri-food research and innovation in the wake of the COVID pandemic. I wanted to give you first a few technical notes, but I also want to thank our sponsor, Ulster, Oskin, and Harcourt LLP. Thank you for your sponsorship of our event. Please note that the chat bar will not be active for the attendees. Only the panelists and host can use it. As panelists, you will be able to use the chat if you're wanting to get a message to another panelist. But attendees will ask their question in the Q&A window viewed by all participants. And if they see a question posed by another attendee that they like, they may upvote the question in order to move it up in the queue. All the panelists will see the questions, but I will read the question before it gets answered to enable some sort of order in the discussion. During the general discussion period, attendees will be asked to click the raise hand button found next to the Q&A bar so they can interact with the panelists and ask a question. Once identified, the host will allow them to unmute themselves so they can speak. Note that attendees will not be visible, but his or her name will attend. Today's panelists are Ted Bilyea, Chief Strategy Officer at the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Ted is an agricultural business leader that has had a major impact on the Canadian agriculture and food industry on a national and international scale throughout his distinguished career. He spent 34 years with Maple Leaf Foods, and as a leading consultant across the entire value chain, Ted Bilyea is one of the select few visionaries who have a deep understanding of the entire agri-food sector and the drivers that determine future success. He certainly brought vision and passion to the competitiveness and export growth for the Canadian agri-food industry, including establishing Canadian pork as a preferred protein in Japan and orchestrating the first shipment of Ontario food-grade soybeans to Japan. He was inducted in the Canadian Agriculture Hall of Fame in 2018. Froehlich is the president and CEO of AgriView, Froehlich Farms. His roots in the world of agriculture reach back to his childhood on the family farm in East Central Saskatchewan. He's an investor and founding shareholder of a number of startup companies in the agriculture, food, and biosciences sector. He has spent the last 4 years working in primary food production, agribusiness, and agri-marketing in Canada, the US, Europe, South America, and Asia. He served as a president of AdFarm, president of West Canada Malting, general manager of operation for the Alberta Pool, and the director of sales and marketing at Hogs Canada. In 2005, he received the Distinguished Agrologist Award from the Alberta Institute of Agrologists and the Alberta Centennial Gold Medal by the province of Alberta. He was inducted in the Bioindustrial Hall of Fame in 2012, and he received an honorary degree from Olds College in 2014. The Honourable Gerry Ritz, formerly Canada's Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food from 2007 to 2015, and from his Saskatchewan roots, the Honourable Gerry Ritz served as a federal agriculture minister during a period when Canada's agri-food sector became recognized as an economic powerhouse. During his 20-year political career as a member of Parliament for Battleford Lloydminster, Ritz served as Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food from 2007 and 2015 and put Canadian agriculture on the world map. He expanded market access for the industry, forged valuable international trading deals, provided market freedom post-Canadian Wheat Board, pushed for innovation through growing forward, and limited the damage from challenges including BSE and country of origin labeling. And I certainly remember the BSE crisis. He was inducted in the Canadian Agriculture Hall of Fame at the same time, I believe, as our former chair, Dr. Wilf Keller, if I'm not mistaken. In terms of sequencing, I'm going to open the webinar by welcoming all of you as attendees. And I'm going to ask each of the panelists to first deliver a few words. Ted has graciously offered to start with a couple of minute presentation that will set the stage for a moderated discussion. So first Ted, then Art, and then Gerry for a few words. Then we'll go to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Serge. I thought it would be helpful for today to look a little bit at the history of agriculture when we talk about innovation. So agriculture innovation has allowed global agriculture to land to feed continuously growing population. However, as the global population continues to grow, farmland is being lost to urbanization, and soil quality in much of the world is badly deteriorating, while the demands for each acre of farmland continues to grow. The Council of Agriculture and Science and Technology, CAST, used that slide that you're looking at, and it identified key scientific advances that allowed us to intensify production from feeding 28 people per acre of land in the early 20th century to 155 by the mid-century, and we're 265 where we are today. During the latter period that we call precision agriculture era, farmers need to feed 265 people per acre of land based on a population of 5.3 billion. By 2050, the existing farmland will be tasked to feed 9.7 billion people, which translates into over 450 people per acre, using no further loss, assuming no further losses of farmland globally. The World Resources Institute estimates that similarly, between 2010 and 2050, about 56% increase is required in calories will be needed to feed that 9.7 billion people. This will require significant intensification in production, while not only requiring no increase in greenhouse gas production, but an actual 15 gigaton drop in global ag emissions, and the need for farmers to remain profitable with all this happening. That is the real challenge that I think we face, and we need to get moving on it because time really is not on our side on this. So maybe I'll stop there and I just thought that might help set up the discussion.
Great, thank you. Art, if you want to say a few words first.
There, am I unmuted? I guess I am now.
You are.
I should be used to this technology after having to do this damn thing for a year, over a year now. But well, thank you very much, Serge, and for the opportunity to be here. I guess I'd like to just start off with a few comments. When one looks at the future, one always has to remember what the lens one's looking through it. And I'm looking at the future and innovation from the lens of from a farm background and still own farmland, but more so as an investor and not a VC investor, but as a private small investor. And I'm like thousands of others in this country. So that's where my comments are going to revolve around when it comes to innovation. I think Gerry has indicated the two major things. When we look at investing in innovation or companies that have new innovation, two things drive that. First and foremost, number one is the fact that we will have a massively increased growing population that we're going to have to produce a lot more food for it, for that population. The second thing is we cannot ignore the impact of climate. I'm not going to debate whether it's what's causing it or what's not causing it, but something is fundamentally happening. And whether we agree in agriculture that it is real or not, I don't think matters anymore at all. So when we look at investing in technologies and innovation, and that's how we determine what innovation is going to look like, we look through those two lenses: growing population, feeding the world, and also climate. Now, I know we're going to get into some questions later, which I'll go into a little more specifically, but those are the two driving factors that we look at when we place our money globally, and we invest around the world. We don't just invest in Canada. Perhaps we can have a conversation later on as to why we don't invest as much in Canada as we should, because most of our investments are now outside of Canada, and we think we've got some fundamental reasons for doing that. But innovation is I always remember when my father-in-law, who would have been well over 100 now, retired from farming in the late 70s, early 80s. I asked him when he stepped away from farming, I said, in all your, and he was a century farmer in Saskatchewan, where I'm from as well. And I asked him, what's the biggest innovations that you saw in the years you started farming in the early 1900s? And he said, well, he said, the first thing was that fundamentally changed the way we farmed. The innovations, we didn't use the word innovation because now it's become a buzzword. Back then it was just new stuff. And he said 2,4-D was an absolute game changer. He said, nobody that farmed before 2,4-D has any idea how big an impact that was. The second thing he mentioned was hydraulics. Now, I'm not that young, but I didn't grow up without hydraulics. Most people now wouldn't know what it's like to farm without hydraulics. And he said, I can't even describe to you as well how that changed farming. So I think we have to look, when we look at innovation, I always look at it from the perspective, is it going to benefit the farmer? Is the farmer going to benefit in his operation? Is it going to become more efficient, more profitable, more sustainable? All of those buzzwords that we have right now that are floating around agriculture. So I know we're going to get into some questions later, but I think Ted has introduced the topic very well. And that's exactly how we look at the globe and what we invest in. The two key issues that he has just brought up, climate and a growing population of somewhere just south of 10 billion by 2050. Thanks, Serge.
Thank you, Art. Gerry, do you want to say a few words before we start the questions? We can't hear you. You're on mute. We still can't. We're getting technical help. Christine, any way for you to unmute Gerry remotely? While this is taking place, while Gerry is, we're getting him unmuted. I just before I go into questions, the reason we've done this panel and the first of this panel and started by those three gentlemen is the combined years of experience in this sector is fantastic. And I think we've got Gerry.
We're back. I had to bring in my techspert here to get us back on again. For some reason, he just disappeared. I was being edited. Having said that, both Ted and Art have really set the stage here well, and it's gentlemen like this that have really set the basis for Canadian agriculture and how well it's received on the global stage. What sets Canada apart is the ability to step up to these challenges that the gentlemen have outlined already. And it won't be without some growing pains, of course, but the foundation of Canadian agriculture, as I've learned, is its ability to adapt and accept new technology and build from that. There's a lot of moving parts. We're only one small part of the value chain. It's global now, and Canada will continue and will be a big part of that moving forward. We look at hurdles in the way, like social licensing, water usage, a lot of demands that are going to be put on agriculture to do more with less and start to feed that growing population, as Ted outlined. You know, the deliverability from Canadian producers and Canadian processors has always been there when we need it, but it's going to take a plan moving forward from this point.
Great. And thank you for that. And indeed, the reason we brought all of you together and we pushed on having this panel is your decades of experience as a group will provide us some answers. While we are looking for solutions in the plan, we also need to look at what has been done in the past, because the agricultural sector has gone through ups and downs and various challenges and has usually gone back bigger and stronger and more effective. And we need to continue that trend. And while the tendency is often to look at the future without looking at the past, we want to bring the future informed by what has been done already. So first question, I think, is the agri-food sector has gone through ups and downs, as I just indicated, and various challenges. The pandemic has introduced indeed new challenges, but also opportunities. What should the research and innovation part of the sector focus on? What key opportunities should be pursued? So I'm opening it up to the panel. Any thoughts? Art. And you are on mute. There we go.
Yeah, I'm unmuted now. Thank you very much. Thanks, Serge. You know, that is, I thought about this question when you sent it out, and this is, you know, a very, very difficult question. You know, what things should we, what opportunities should be pursued? I think there's so much new innovation and ideas coming at us right now that it's almost, it's impossible to keep up with all of them. And I think we have to, as a country, we have to narrow down where our strategic advantages are, where our comparative advantages are, and focus on those. I believe that there are 3 or 4 major opportunities that we should be focusing on. The first one being this whole data IT area. We are being swamped with data. I've had a background in the genomics sector. Genomics is now just getting it figured out as to how to amass all of the data that they're accumulating and take advantage of it. But we're having so much information coming to us as producers, as processors, and I'm not so sure how we're going to decide which ones. We probably get a dozen requests a month from companies who want us to invest in their new platform, their new app of one kind or another. Many of them are very bright and very brilliant people, but I don't think they're going to have the staying power or a unique idea, because by the time you think of something, when I went to business school at Wharton, they told us, when you think of something, rest assured somebody's already thought about it before you. And I think we've got to understand that. So data will be the first big thing that's the first big innovation that we're going to have to take advantage of. And you just look at what TELUS has done recently in moving into that area, moving from traditional. The other area that I think, even though I think some of us in agriculture struggle with, is the whole idea of plant-based protein. Now, we've used plant-based protein all our lives, canola oil, beer, you know, we've used plant-based protein in bread all our lives, but it's going to take a new dimension right now. And the reason I think we have to take that very seriously is the consumer is changing. And we have, in agriculture, I don't think we've ever paid attention to the consumer as well as we should have. You know, we export our products to probably 30 countries around the world right now. And Ted can talk about this, and Gerry much better than I can, but consumers are much more sophisticated in many parts of the world than we have in Canada. You know, they really are. They're much more demanding, much more quality focused, and tastes and are different. The other thing, one of the areas that we feel so strongly about is the whole area of water and nutrient use efficiency. Water will be the single biggest issue facing agriculture productivity as we move ahead, without question in our mind. So we're always looking at the latest technologies that we can find anywhere in the world that enhance the water and nutrient efficiency of plants. Most of those are not coming from Canada. Europe is primarily, Asia is developing. We're just looking at some brand new technology out of Malaysia right now that looks incredibly promising. But we've got to be able to deal with the shortage of water that we're going to be facing. We have a family charitable foundation, so we do charity work in the developing world. And when I go to those places, immediately you get an appreciation how valuable water is, and how, if you don't have it, how devastating it is. Incredibly productive areas in Peru are now deserts because the city of Lima has pulled all the water out of those productive valleys, and they're now literally deserts. So, and that's happening all over the globe. The last one I would think is becoming a little bit passé and a little bit underestimated, this whole area of genomics. I think we're just touching the surface of what genomics can bring to agriculture in terms of livestock and crop production, health of animals. I know the COVID has really brought to the fore this whole area of the transference of diseases from animals to humans, the old zoonosis area. And I think that's one area where Canada could punch well above its weight in dealing with that. And I think Ted can talk about that much more effectively than I can. So those would be the 4 technologies, innovations that we would see as being the most important: water use efficiency, genomics, data, and this whole plant-based ingredient business that is emerging, that I think is going to revolutionize the way consumers eat and the way we produce food.
Thank you very much, Art. And you're correct on the water issue. Just look at the news every day about Ethiopia and Egypt and the potential wars over there over water. It's quite something. In terms of genomics, I'm happy to see that within the attendees, we have Genome Canada, who are doing a very good job on a number of issues related to that. So happy to see them, and I'm sure we'll have questions from them as well. I'm going to move to Gerry. Gerry, on the same question.
Yeah, certainly Art's made some good points, and I won't belabor those. I'll try to add on a little bit. I think first and foremost, we have to stabilize the farm gate. There's a lot of stress and strain out there on the family farm. They're getting bigger, they're getting much more effective and efficient than they ever have before, but there needs to be government work done on the taxation and regulatory side that will help relieve some of that burden. Government never has worked at the speed of commerce, but they have to start stepping up if we're going to be making the changes that consumers are going to be demanding, and trade corridors to remain open. It's got to be government that does that, but it has to be done at the speed of commerce. And I think working with the full value chain rather than just picking sectors of it and saying, well, this will draw that and this will strengthen that. If we don't have everybody around that table talking about the solutions, somebody's going to be left out, and it's just not going to work. Timeliness is going to be a major factor in moving forward. And as Art pointed out, data is going to be a key. And a lot of that is to do with traceabilities for some of those discerning buyers around the world. The Japanese market will pay a premium, but they want to know exactly who grew it. And I mean, if you take your phone into a store in Japan and click on the barcode, it'll give you the name of the pig and the farmer hugging it. And that's the type of thing that they want to see. So I think we have to start looking at the full value chain a lot more than we have been.
Absolutely. Definitely. Ted.
So first off, I think both Art and Gerry have made it pretty clear what some of these priorities are. I really think, Art, you nailed it when you said, that there are some things that are just immutable, and water is one of, for soil. You have soil and water. Without that, we're pretty well doomed in the regular agriculture that we have today. I'd like to go back though and pick up one more point, and that is that if we looked at thought about that chart we showed at the beginning in the mid-century with the Green Revolution, it solved the feeding problems of the day, but it also tended to create other problems and in depth. The overuse of fertilizers became a problem later for the GHG and the water. But the one that Art picked up, I mean, that problem with the Green Revolution was that we produce food all over the world in areas that were having difficulty before because we drilled millions of wells. And now we're seeing exactly what Art said, the fact that many of those areas are running out of water because they've drained their water tables. And that's a big problem, and it's a growing concern. So clearly, we're going to have to learn how to do agriculture with far less water, and we need to have a different way as we think about this, because we're entering into a period of time where knowledge intensity in this business is going to blow people away. It's even for any of the science disciplines that are working in this. The problem is that they're working a mile deep and an inch wide, and so you can solve one problem, and like the Green Revolution, you can create another. And so what I think it's teaching us is we almost have to take what I would call a One Health approach and a One Health paradigm when we look at how we're going to develop new technologies to be able to solve that grand challenge that we talked about in the beginning, which is really the challenge of as it was said, how do we produce more and better products? As Gerry was saying, we got to we've got to add value to these products inherently. How do we do that without essentially creating other problems? And those other problems that we know very well today are things like GHGs. I think the technology actually exists in nascent form in various places, that we're going to be able to produce far more food and with far less damage. But we have to be careful that we're not sowing the seed because we are not emphasizing the need for transdisciplinary knowledge in all these projects. And so if I had one thing I think we learned, particularly coming out of COVID, was you really are nowhere if you don't have a truly healthy economy in all respects. And the only way we're going to get there is by having significant transdisciplinary work when we approach these grand challenges.
Great. No, and I appreciate that. Thank you, Ted. I think you've all identified interesting issues. And one of the things that, Ted, you just said is produce more food. And I think we certainly, through the research and innovation that is being done, I think we can get there. But one of the things that we're hearing is, what about people? We do need to make sure that we have people to harvest, process, distribute, and do the research. And we are facing human resource crunch. A number of years ago, I remember going on a trade mission with Jason Kenney in those days on the skills gap. And we do still have a number of problems to fill jobs that are at the present time remaining unfilled. So one question that has been asked by the audience, I think, is how can we, and by Dr. Diane Patterson from Dalhousie, is how can we encourage and assist non-traditional human involvement, i.e. encourage new immigrants to Canada, Indigenous groups, African Canadians to become involved in agriculture, research, and support. I think that's an important question based on the need to move ahead. But if we're not going to be able to do it, and robotics and artificial intelligence is not going to do everything, so how do we do this without involving those groups? Can you help us on that? Art.
I was afraid you were going to ask me that question, Serge. And that is, there's no question. If we look at the companies we're dealing with right now, both food and non-food, most of the food innovation that's coming to Canada are with new Canadians. That's where it's coming from. I think last statistic I read is 50% of the new food products, or slightly more than 50%, are being developed by new Canadians. And so I think we've got to encourage that. And again, how do we get the First Nations communities involved in agriculture? I don't know that I have an answer for that, but there are some things that are emerging out there that I see very encouraging. Recent conversations with Farm Credit Canada and some of the programs that they're involving themselves in with First Nations and agriculture, and some of the work that's being done there, nutrition programs, agricultural programs, investment programs. So I think there's a germ of an idea there. It's interesting when we work elsewhere in the world with our investments or in our non-for-profit work. Quite often we're working with Indigenous communities. That's who we work with. People who've been displaced from the Amazon of Peru to the slums of Lima, and they have an agricultural background because that's where they came from. And really, they're quite capable of learning new things and new ideas and new technologies and implementing things in agriculture if they can have the tools and a little bit of a help up. But I don't know if I'm sure I'm not answering the question. The one point I would like to make, though, is that I think, Gerry, you're the last Minister of Agriculture I ever met in Canada. I don't know any ministers of agriculture provincially or federally in Canada right now. I don't travel in those circles. It's way above my pay grade. So, Gerry, I think you were the last one I met was and that was quite a while ago, I would suspect. But I think if I could say anything to our provincial and federal leaders, political leaders now, is don't forget, we've got to create talent here. And if we can't create all the talent, let's bring it into Canada, because we need the best biologists, the best physicists, the best chemists, the best microbiologists that we can get our hands on in agriculture. And we need the best engineers we can get our hands on. And the energy industry is chucking them out like crazy. There's got to be process engineers that we got to convince to come into agriculture and food, because they can bring a lot of value. So I would encourage that to happen. So don't short shift our post-secondaries, be they colleges or universities, making sure we're going to continue to graduate the type of people that this industry is going to need. And we're going to need a lot of them, and they're going to have to be really smart. You know, I'll say we do most of our research in the United States. We find the colleges and universities in the United States are much more receptive to working with small startup companies like we do than Canadian universities and colleges are. They just have a different attitude, totally different attitude down there. And it seems to work for us. And we may be a unique example, but I don't think so. So I'm sure I didn't answer the question, and I've rambled on way too long, sir. So.
But yeah, and you brought another issue that I'll want to get into in a few minutes. You're not the only person that's facing the challenge with academia, and I think we need to get into that and look into why are people investing or doing some of the research south of the border. But Gerry, if I can ask you to answer the question, how do we involve those groups, African Canadians, newcomers, Indigenous people? How do we involve them?
Well, I think two thrusts I take at it. One is governments identify these types of things and they make a grandiose announcement, but they don't have the nuts and bolts in place, and then they walk away. They're done. They've made the announcement, they put some money at it, but it never really happens because they haven't done the homework that you've got to define the program before you budget it. And that's what most governments do wrong, is they announce a pot of money and then say, there, go build something, and they rely on somebody else to do it. It doesn't happen. I think one of the other things that I noticed when we were talking about bringing in workers for some of the needs that were happening in Ontario and British Columbia, and I'm talking pickers and things like that, it's all about comfort. They want the sense of community. And it's really hard to grow good crops in downtown Toronto where the Haitian community is centered, or it's really hard to grow, that type of thing. Nobody wants to live out in the hinterlands. They want to have access to that community. And some of that is problematic with the First Nations as well. It comes down to logistics. The ground they have might be acceptable to graze cattle on or grow crops, but how do you get it to market? It comes down to that basic logistics things. So there's no easy solution, but there certainly has to be tackled, and it has to start with those that have the money. That's the governments of the day. Industry will step up and make these things happen if there's a program that they can, a template, as it were, that they can start to make adapt to what they need. I totally agree with Art. I mean, everything, and Ted is saying it too, everything to do with agriculture now is global. And we have to get beyond this idea that, where I live in Saskatchewan, my father and my grandfather never got that far from home with delivering their crops and so on. Now I put stuff on a truck and it goes God knows where, so I mean, we have to look at global solutions here, not just local.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Ted?
I don't think I can add much to that, because I think the other two gentlemen covered it pretty well. I just say that Canada has a bit of an advantage here, and we just got to figure out how to use it better. Because unlike the U.S., we have a pretty open door to immigration, and we tend to select the best, and that has stood us in great stead recently. We're finding we're hitting well above our weight in the areas of new technologies in Canada. Particularly, some of the some people have referred to some of our cities as the new Silicon Valleys, in fact, and that technology is going to drive agriculture. So I think the manual labor problem is forever with us in Canada. I mean, we are not going to solve that by anything we do importing people. we'll always find somebody in the world that can do stuff with labor cheaper than us. And so what we turn to, and we've got to make work better for ourselves, is the fact that this is becoming, agriculture and food are becoming the key, essentially brain intensive business, and we got to bring the best brains in. I would refer everybody to, there was a great white paper written recently by Genome Ontario, I believe it is. I'll try to dig it up for you. And they really they look at this in some depth, and it's pretty clear to me that they've isolated the key advantage for our knowledge intensive industries in Canada are our resource industries, and agriculture leads the pack in that way. So I think it's ours to be lost if we don't focus on that knowledge intensive piece and bring people from wherever we can get them, and I think they'll come gladly.
Great, thank you. I think through the answers that you all gave, we started to discuss already the role of the government and the role that the government needs to play. And governments are both seen as enablers and obstacles to growth in a way. We've talked about regulations, we've talked about them needing to step up because they've got the resources, and them providing money, but then not following up on that. So, I'll use part of Dr. Peter Desai's question in terms of how do we get a national ag strategy to align with the priorities that were just described, but I will also ask in terms of it, having a national ag strategy would be great, but at the same time, governments are going to go through a significant belt tightening exercise. We've got a great agriculture sector in Canada, but we haven't yet found how to grow money on trees or crops. And we're spending a huge amount of money at one point. There will be a belt tightening exercise. So how do we make sure that we keep getting agri-food research and innovation at the center, and how do we get a national ag strategy to align with the issues and the priorities that you've described, and make sure that we're able to move forward? I'm going to ask Gerry to answer that first question.
Well, one of the biggest strengths that Canada has is our diversity. And one of the biggest weaknesses Canada has is our diversity when you try to put together a national ag strategy. I always used to joke, if you put 3 farmers in a room, you get 5 opinions. Then if you throw in some processors, you're going to get 10 or 12. Everybody's got a different view of what the end result should be and how you should arrive at it. When we talk about, the buzzwords today are build back, because we've seen our economy take a huge hit in this last year. It's going to take generations to build it back. But the first thing I think governments have to recognize at all levels is that agriculture is foundational. When you want return on investment, agriculture is going to be your best bet. Every crop year, every animal that's raised and so on is going to have a return attached to it. So an investment in agriculture is going to be one of the smartest things, and should be the first thing that governments do to stabilize our economy. We all have to eat. Agriculture is foundational. It creates a tremendous amount of jobs for every job that's actually on the farm itself, and that needs to be addressed and looked at. We tried a number of different times through a number of different venues to get a national strategy as such. I'm not even sure it's possible. With the going beyond the fact that governments have to have a short, mid, and long-term view of what agriculture can do, when you've got to remortgage the farm every generation and you've got to, break that down into 3 or 5 year increments, you're paying over and over and over again to have the right to produce that food that everybody wants. Social licenses has been thrown up as a hurdle in front of today's farmers, where they have to justify everything they do, and held to a lens that isn't practical in a lot of ways. So there's, the biggest problem with any plan is finding a beginning and making sure you're not pulling on the wrong thread. And governments tend to get too many threads out there and start pulling on them because they want the announcements, and everything is done on a budgetary cycle or an election cycle. And when you look for stability from governments, it just doesn't exist in that extent. We have great operations in this country, the Grain Commission, the Farm Credit Corporation, a lot of pillars like that. Industry itself is very strong, but how do you tie it all together? I'm still scratching my head over that one.
Yeah, and before I ask one of the other panelists to answer, I'm going to push a little bit on the answer you just gave, Gerry. I've traveled all over the world, and I've seen a number of countries who have, as an example, one food innovation center, countries that are much bigger than Canada's. And in Canada, we have a tendency, because of the diversity, but also the provincial and regional realities, that if one region has one thing, we must therefore have it in another region.
Yep.
And the federal government is more than happy to throw money at it to create and duplicate what already exists in other parts of the country. And at one point, not only do we have too many centers with a whole bunch of overhead costs that diminish our effectiveness, but we also have way too many organizations that exist and that purport to be the voices of X or the voices of Y, and that really diminish the effectiveness of the sector on that. Do we have a problem in Canada on that front, or in what type of leadership will it take to actually say at one point we do need a national strategy? Not everybody is going to be happy, and a lot of people will be unhappy, but we need to move ahead regardless. Do we need to fund research into things that we know are going to bring absolutely no return on investment, no jobs, no growth, no nothing, but is just a regional oddity that maybe is great for tourism, but has absolutely no relevance to our system? Sorry, I'm pushing you a little bit.
No, that's an excellent point. And that's what gave rise to, during my tenure, we had what we called results-based investments that way. We would talk to industry. We had value chain roundtables for every major group. And we would talk to them and say, okay, what do you need? What do you think is the hot button issue? And we did that with trade as well. And when those things started to intersect, that's where we invested our money. It makes sense to do just that you reverse engineer it, as it were, and then put a budget to it. So we ended up getting a lot more done for less money faster, because all the expertise went into one location, not scattered across the country in several. You also diminish the effect of your experts and your staffing when you've got it spread out that widely. So a much more focused group working on a system will come up with an answer a lot more than trying to play politics with it rather than being pragmatic.
Great. Art, I'm going to ask you to follow up on that.
I think Gerry brings up some very good points. I don't know how you could ever get consensus in agriculture in this whole industry. I wouldn't have a clue how to do it, and I feel badly for the people who attempt to do it. I think it's just a really tough task, and even when I know it's no secret, I was never a big fan of the Canadian Wheat Board, but even during those years, this whole single desk selling and right to choose, it was huge separation of opinions on that, and that was just one small part of agriculture, a big part to those people who happen to grow wheat. So I'm not so sure. I think Gerry's right. I don't know how you're ever going to get consensus here. I think maybe Ted can do it because he's got the contacts that everybody else does. So I wouldn't even know where to start, as Gerry says on that. The point I would like to make is I think governments do some good things. There's some things that were developed. I can look at the Genome Canada and the genome centers in this country, the great work that they've done. I look in the province of Saskatchewan, AgWest Bio, and the great work that AgWest Bio does, sort of bringing a whole disparate group of people together and have one focus for the province, dealing with everything from trade to research and development and back and forth. So there are some great things that have happened. So I don't want to, but I think there's some things that government, let's go after the low-hanging fruit. What are some of the things that are most important to the agricultural sector? Number one is infrastructure. Whether you're shipping bulk commodities in 140 car trains, which seems to be, or 134 car trains, which seems to be the way we're going now, not the way we're going, we're already there, but we're talking about doing food ingredients. How are we going to get all those containers? Because you're not going to put those in rail cars, I would suspect, very easily. You're going to have to get containers to the east and the west coast. And right now, I don't know if you've tried to ship some pulses recently, it's not that damn easy. And if you can find containers, you pay a hell of a lot more for them. So I think infrastructure is something that's really important. Port infrastructure, I think, is important to, we're moving volumes to the West Coast that we never thought were possible 10 years ago. And production in Canada is going up and up and up. And whether we produce ingredients here, more ingredients and more processing here, we're still going to need that infrastructure. So I think pick some things that would have appeal to a broad base in the industry if there's such a thing. And I think infrastructure might be one that we can look at getting all governments. The Northwest Corridor, I know that's been talked about for years. How can we take advantage of Prince Rupert's to eliminate some of the congestion in Vancouver using Prince Rupert more by doing that Northwest Corridor? Not sure I really understand it, but it sounds like a real good idea. So you'd think there'd be some things like that we could work on. So we spend a lot of time talking about pipelines, but we don't talk enough about talking infrastructure and moving agricultural products as we do. God forbid if a pipeline is challenged, we get everybody behind it. But if agriculture commodities are challenged getting to market, we don't give it the kind of we only give it lip service. We don't give it the real seriousness that it should have.
Agreed. And that's because agriculture has taken a back step to the natural resource sector for quite a while, and that's created some of the issues. Ted, I hear that you're going to build a consensus.
I wish I wouldn't do that because I can't. I can't do it any better than Art or Gerry. Ag is a very complex business in Canada. But I mean, the question you were asking is, what can government do in times when they're tightening their belt? The one thing I think we have to remember around that is that government also wants to not only recover but thrive in the future. And so I go back to the Barton report and I look again at what the ag strategy tables talk to us about, and Art definitely nailed one of the points that was in their recommendations about, let's get the right infrastructure. There's many things we can do in Canada. We actually move stuff around quite differently than the US, and we need to think about that. So I'm with Art on that. But one of the other things I think that's important is that, and I think it was said early on, that we need to figure out what are the key things that we have to do, and that if we do them well are going to bring us the biggest dollars and the biggest bucks. And we did outline that one of the key issues here is essentially sustainable intensification, what CAPI, Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, calls sustainable intensification. And that's really doing a lot more with a lot less and and making it a lot better. In order to pull that off, one of the things we have to do is define very clearly what it is we want to do. And many times, as I think Gerry said, we don't define that going in very well. And then the second piece of that is also to make sure, I know I'm hard on the same subject, that we bring a lot of different disciplines to the subject. And I'll just give you one example where it's gone well, but actually maybe too well in some respects, because we didn't get it right when we went at it. If you look at everybody knows this example, so I'll be quick, but the dairy industry, in North America is a pretty interesting example where we increased, dairy production massively. And we can, I don't know, depending on whose cow we're talking about, you can produce somewhere between 9,000 and 12,000 kilograms of milk a year per cow, whereas in China and India, they can only do between 1,000 and 3,000 kilos and so they need 5 times as many cows, and they have 5 times as much GHG and methane as we do, because we've been able to sustainably intensify. But the sidebar of that is beginning to worry the industry a little bit is, as we increase that milk production, we really began to decrease the ability for breeding. And as we were going after a single trait, thinking about that trait, let's produce more milk, and not looking at all the different possibilities and traits. When we look back at how did we get there? Well, where we are today, if you look at all the cows in North America, something like 9 million of them, so in US, 1 million or so in Canada, of dairy cows, 99% of those Holstein bulls can be traced back to two bulls in the 60s. And so it should have dawned on us somewhere along the line that inbreeding to that extent may create a problem. But now, as we move into the world of the phytobiome and micro in plants and microbiome, you know, with animals, the complications here get massive. And that's why I think so some of the examples where government has spent and it begins to look like things may be working, I would throw in the window something like the living labs, for example, where the knowledge that we're learning is being fed down very rapidly and tried at the ground level, so we can see if there's any problems with what's being generated very quickly. I think that kind of process with government involved would be useful. I'll go one step further, and I know this is probably very controversial and people won't like what I'm going to say, but we need to bring these knowledge organizations, these big funding councils together, because I think things like CIHR and SHRC and NSERC, they should be brought together, because it's going to take all of those people and all of those types of sciences acting together to get these projects right. And we can't afford to go down the street that that the dairy industry was going down and discover somewhere down there that, you know, you're going to wind up with one cow producing all the milk, but unable to breed at the end of the day. And it's exaggerating, obviously, but I want to get the point fairly clearly across that we have to bring more and creative thinking from various different sciences. And then we have to do it at ground level, involving producers right at the ground.
I appreciate that. We talked about academia and the role of academia, and we did get a question from Dr. Buzzard from UBC. And the question is, could the panelists please comment further on the role of academia? What are their thoughts on how universities might better serve the Canadian agri-food sector? And I think that's I'm going to ask Art to reply to that first.
Well, you're probably starting with the wrong. I was probably the world's worst university student. I think there were 42 in my graduating class, and I think I was 41st. I think there was maybe one student who had lower marks than I did. But having said that, there's no question. I spent a lot of time at universities, in colleges and universities in Canada, in the United States, primarily a few in Europe, and I think what we look for out of our institutions of higher learning are really three things. Number one, getting a handle on what kind of basic research they're doing, because a lot of the products and services we're going to have in the future have to start with basic research someplace. And I don't like when we put such restrictions on universities doing, I don't really care very much when we say, well, there's got to be a commercial outcome for what you're doing or else you can't do it. In all fairness, we wouldn't have a clue. And I think a lot of the developments we've made, we didn't know what that commercial outcome was, and it turned out to be a real amazing development in many cases. So that's the first thing we want to do. The second thing we want to do is how do you transfer that knowledge out of the universities? And this is where it gets a bit awkward in Canada, because we do have a system here where getting intellectual property out of a university or taking new products into a university to have research done on them can get very complicated. And it's very hard to work through that. We find universities in the United States are much easier. If we have something we're developing from another country, we bring it into North America, we want it to be tested at universities or colleges, much easier to negotiate with them than they tend to be in Canada, for a whole bunch of reasons that I don't really understand all of them. So you gravitate, business people can be quite simple. You gravitate to where it's the easiest to get things done. And if that's not here, then we go there. The third thing at universities that we need is they've got to continue to turn out the very best that they can, the very best graduates that they can. Not just all university degree graduates, but college diploma people, to work in our labs, to work in our fields, and to work in our factories. So we need just cohorts of outstanding graduates, whether they're from Canada or outside of Canada, doesn't really matter. So I think those are the kind of things. The suggestion I would make is talk to industry. Just reach out, talk to them. And don't always go to an association of members of a group. Go out to individuals in an industry that you've heard about, that you do some searching and get their opinions. And if they can, we'll always give opinions, rightfully, wrongfully so, but you'll find, on occasion, you'll find a good one. And I'm probably not the person to talk to because I don't have very many good ones, but there are people out there that have very good opinions. But just reach out and talk to them, especially in the entrepreneurial small business community, because we're kind of a group out there that's anonymous. It's easy to go to the big corporations because you know who they are, you know who runs them. When it comes to the entrepreneurial community, we're a little harder to find, we're a little harder to get a hold of, we're a little harder to meet with, but take that opportunity if you can.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Ted and then followed by Gerry for a few comments on academia.
So I think I probably gave the best one that I already that I can think of, and that is that somehow we need to spend more time on thinking together across the various disciplines than just going deep. Because if we can do that, then we will solve these grand challenges, these big problems. If we can't do that, I think that it is very difficult. And then it becomes what Art was saying. It becomes a challenge because you've invented something but the academic may not know what it can be used for, and the industry is isolated. It doesn't. But if there's a team trying to solve a problem, that's a very different issue. Then you get somewhere. You have a Manhattan Project, and by God, we need a few of those right now. I mean, this is we can all find ways that we can stay more reasonably profitable in the short to medium term, and we can pull stuff out of universities that help us do that. But we don't have the solutions for the grand challenges. So that essentially means our grandchildren or great-grandchildren, they're screwed. They're really done. And that's my biggest concern, is that the academics need to look at themselves and ask themselves a simple question: am I doing something that's really useful for Canada, rather than just roughing up my resume? That's where I think I think that's the question that needs to be asked. And money should be going to solve the big problems and get the teams together that can do it. I think you'd find a lot of participation by business as soon as you went down that street, because business is doing their best to solve these big problems, but they don't have the solutions. And so they're doing what they can, but they don't really have the solutions.
Gerry?
Well, both Ted and Art have touched on this. To my mind, it's all about partnerships. It's a grouping of academia who have access to government grant money, industry who are private sector dollars, and I think of things like Canterra, who are celebrating their 25th anniversary this year, that make investments, and then of course all of the farm commodity groups, including the wheat commissions and canola councils and pulse groups and so on, corn and soy, all have checkoffs that farmers put in. Where the problems erupt is the direction that needs to be taken. What do you go after first? And who owns the royalties when you have something that wins? So those arguments need to be settled as a sidebar, but it's those partnerships where you get direction from the farmer, you have investments and the academics and so on like that can take it and run with it in the lab and in the field trials with the private sector groups. That's the answer. We've got agreements with countries in the southern hemisphere to grow crops in the off season from up here, so we can get our genomics in play faster. We've got access to global groups, genomics groups, and so on like that can help us, map out the genome of wheat and then go from there. Once you've got that blueprint, the sky's the limit. And we've done that with livestock, with centers of excellence, and so on that are based at universities. But it's those partnerships that will make this thing work.
Great, and I appreciate that. And
can I just, Serge,
Yep.
Can I just add, I'd like to just make one comment. I think Ted brought up an incredibly important point, which I'd want to comment on. And that is, and Gerry just as well, the Center of Excellence. About 18 years ago, in our wisdom, we thought, there's got to be another solution for some of these big global issues. And we sat down with an inventor outside of North America, and he came to us with some technology that were biologicals. I didn't really even know what the heck a biological was then. Had we have known then how long it would take and how expensive it would be to develop these things, we probably should have run. But the fact of the matter is, we went ahead with it, I don't even want to tell you how many tens of millions of dollars we put into that technology. But the thing that got us turned around is we went to a university in the US because they had some basic knowledge there, and they were quite interested in this as well. They thought there may be something to this, and they created a center of excellence and recruited some staff and professors and scientists from other universities, big ones. And we paid commercially for the space and the greenhouses. That was the impetus for us to continue to work on this to where it's now a very successful product in the marketplace. So I hadn't thought about TED, but these centers of excellence are really important if they're focused and you have the right people and the right researchers and the right scientists and the right commercial advice that they can also provide. So I just had to comment, Ted, that I hadn't thought about that, but a good point.
Well, the centers of excellence draw all the parts and pieces from all over to them. And all of a sudden you've got the pieces to the puzzle and you can put it together.
Absolutely. You all have talked about partnerships in different ways, between industry and academia, different types of partnerships with our neighbors in South America, in a way. Canada's relationship with our sovereign neighbor has gone through ups and downs, and there's a new US administration that presents new challenges for Canada in terms of research and innovation priorities. There's a question from one of the attendees, a comment, I would say, from one of the attendees, Dr. Hoyos Villegas, who indicated that indeed Canada has many more, the US, attracts many more research scientists than Canada does, even in proportion, due to their policies. How do we adapt to a new US administration? How do we do more partnerships with global organization, global partners, in order to expand our opportunities? How do we manage this? Ted.
I'm not sure that I've got a simple answer to that, because and I don't know if anybody does really. But the first, let me try to describe the way I see the problem first, and then we can maybe figure out the solution. But when we talk about these big challenges again, we've got a problem that Canada identifies some of the aspects of these challenges quite differently than the US does. So when probably the best example I can give you at the moment is the way we both countries seem under the new administration and what we have in today. We're approaching the whole GHG emissions things somewhat differently. And in the Canadian one, we know we've gone out first with the essentially the stick, which is the carbon tax, and then as of last week, we put some ideas in place that are going to have to be developed, but they're around how do we provide payment for offsets. The U.S. is taking quite a different approach. Their stick is going to be looking at standardized standards for curbing emissions of the big emitters first, and I see zero chance that there's going to be a carbon tax in the window. So we have to figure out how we're going to make these two systems work together at the border. And that's going to be no mean feat, I don't think. So when we see a US system where they're talking about using the Commodity Credit Corporation to fund a carbon bank and paying for sequestration and investing significant amounts of money in innovation to drive that system, that's their view, whereas ours is much more that if you raise the carbon tax, entrepreneurs will find ways that they can bring these innovations forward just to stay alive. I think we've got a big issue there, and one that I think we're going to have to be very creative on working on with the Americans, so that we don't wind up with the worst of both worlds, which is a carbon border adjustments that apply to some sectors, not necessarily to the agricultural crop, but to the manufacturing processes on either side of the border. And I have great fears that we could wind up exporting some of our carbon intensive food manufacturing industries or fertilizer industry and things like that, unless we can solve some of this thing. Because the last, Canada in general is pretty good at these measurements. When we measure the Canadian industry, particularly the ag side of the industry, we fare extremely well with the rest of the world. But once you start to process that, that's going to be a different story. If you have tax on the one side and no tax on the other side of the border, you're going to get carbon leakage going on from industries that are actually pretty good, but not perfect. And so I think that's my best counsel would be that we need to spend a lot of time bringing these two systems closer in alignment. And that means probably Canada, being more sensitive to where the US is going and figuring out ways that we can make our system emulate their system, or we could wind up losing.
Okay. Gerry?
Yeah, Ted actually nailed it. I had written down out migration, and that's a big fear. We're seeing a lot of that happening right now. The problem is we're being punished with upstream and downstream taxes where we import the same commodity with none of that attached. So it really creates a distortion in the marketplace that doesn't drive any types of efficiency here. Those people just move out. The biggest difference, I think, between Canada and the US is the US sees us as a major market competitor into the Asia Pacific market. We have a free trade agreement with the European Union, which they're trying to emulate. They haven't yet. We haven't taken full advantage of that yet either, but it's going to be happening. Further to that, the US has always been our processing sector. We export half our pork to the US. We buy back half the pork from them. It's different cuts and so on, but that's how it works. Country of origin labeling started to show exactly how much the Americans rely on Canada as a colony when it comes to supplying all those foodstuffs. And it was their state level and their commodity marketplace folks that really took their own government to task and helped us win that fight. I firmly believe within a year or so, we're going to see that thing rear its ugly head again. Our CAF would be out there talking about it, pushing it. Tom Vilsack is the Secretary of Agriculture again. He was the guy pushing that the last time. I firmly believe we're going to see that again, and our sector should start to get ready for that.
Agreed. Art?
I completely agree with Ted's analysis when it comes to the whole climate and carbon issue. I can't add a thing to it. I think Gerry has summed up some of the market access issues that we're facing. A lot of small manufacturers that we work with in Canada right now, for a number of reasons, exchange rates and arbitraging the market and location, are looking at their next investment, their next plant they're going to build are going to be in partnership with somebody in the US. The jobs will be in the US. It's much easier to do business in the US if you have a footprint in the US, whether you're a Canadian company or not. And I think we're starting to see more and more of that happening now. Being a very proud Canadian, I think we have better welders in this country than anywhere else in the world. And we can do as good a job or better than they can in the US. But, for those reasons, we're going to relocate some operations or expand our operations into the US. So, market access is something we sort of don't talk about anymore, but it's going to be more and more and more important. These trade deals, I don't understand them. I don't understand how they work. I don't really understand how they benefit Canadians or not benefit us, but market access is going to become a bigger issue. And I think what Ted has talked about on the whole carbon and climate area is just going to complicate it to the point where, unless you're a huge company and can afford a lot of advisors and lawyers and people like that, how can you understand it? It's going to be a huge challenge. So, but having said everything I've just said, we haven't really noticed much of a difference between the previous administration, the one before that, and this one is too early to tell yet. So we do have a way of working things out with the US. It does happen, but I'm especially worried about this attitude towards keeping the isolationism that's happening in the US, and also what Ted has talked about. Those things I don't really understand, more so the isolation one than the climate one.
Thank you. Talking about climate change and challenges, but going to another part of it, which is really food wastage. Dr. Raj Ladha, one of our board members, indicates that nearly 40 to 60% of the food produced is wasted post-harvest. If we could reduce the wastage, we could also reduce the pressure on land and food production. How do we address this somewhat? What's especially in view of what's taken place during COVID, where some shelves were empty for a portion of time? How do we address wastage when on occasion we do without? Gerry.
You know, that seems to be the topic of discussion in a lot of different fronts at this point. There's a number of things. We talked about infrastructure that needs to be upgraded and so on. We import probably half of what we consume in this country, and we export 80%. And it all comes down to the timeliness of that exporting. Storage on the shelves is another thing that is a major commitment. One of the trips that I made to Israel, I was in some food bunkers, and you know, being a country in the situation that they find themselves, they've always tried to have stores of food on hand in case they're ever cut off. They had potatoes in a bin that were in the same bin for almost 3 years. They still look like the day they were taken out of the ground. They've got some new ideas in how they treat that type of thing, and we need to look at that as well. You know, again, it's one of those threads that needs to be pulled, but how do you get to the bottom of it? There's such a diversity in the foodstuffs in Canada that there's always going to be waste because of the timeliness of the just-in-time deliveries and so on. And COVID really accentuated that when truckers were stopped at the border and held up, and you know, different things that go like that. We always called it Korean inspection, where they leave things on the dock to the point where they're not usable, and then they won't pay you for them. But you know, there's better work to be done. But again, it's got to be the full value chain involved in those discussions, not just the grocery stores, not just the distribution centers and so on, but the full value chain.
Absolutely, I agree. Art, if you can talk, address food wastage, please.
I'm not so sure I can talk about it very much. You know, I tried to solve this food wastage system during COVID by gaining 20 pounds. So I was reducing the food wastage as much as I could personally. But no, clearly, when you look at the data around the world, it is a massive issue. You're right, it is 40%. We could feed a lot more people with a lot less production. I don't know what the answer is. I get the impression that it's starting to be taken much more seriously than it ever has been, which is a very good thing. But I really don't have a solution for it. You know, we've owned in the past, we no longer do, food retail locations. Made every effort in the world to, you know, day-old bread or at the end of the day, you give food to the food banks and those sorts of things. And I think that's all happens. But I think the biggest food wastage is what we throw out of our own kitchens and our own refrigerators and our own freezers that we don't use. There's going to be a cultural shift in Canada that's going to make that happen. How you make that happen, I don't know.
And I fully agree on the kitchen side, and the 20 pounds for myself as well. Ted.
So I the only contribution I can make to this is that I don't know how we stop people throwing out food, but but I do see food waste, depending on what kind of waste we're talking about, as really being the feedstock for biomanufacturing, and we are doing some of that. You know, certainly I remember when we had our when I was in Maple Leaf and we had the first biodiesel, and we had buses in Montreal running on on essentially stuff that the plant waste, so to speak. So repurposing is a big piece of what the new bioeconomy is going to be doing. And it depends where you are in the world too, and what really is the cause of food waste. So food waste in Canada is not because we have a lot of crops, like going to waste in the fields, not making it to market. That's food waste in the developing world. But in Canada, as you said, it's the food waste is occurring after, well after the crop is into a store or processed. And in those cases, that's really feedstock. One of the worst things that I've ever seen happen in my career was when I can say when I first went to China. China was, for all intents and purposes, they were a circular economy. They aren't now, because there was no such thing as food waste in China. Everything got fed to pigs, and China fed itself through that that circular economy. Today, they are changing to our form of thing where they have to import the corn and all the other feed grains and soybean in order to feed those pigs. And they're going to have a massive food waste problem because there's no circular economy anymore. So part of it is the way we think about these things, so I just see food waste as essentially feedstock for the bioeconomy.
Yeah, part of it is a first world problem as well. In other developing countries, food wastage is certainly very different, at least for different reasons when it occurs. We've talked about the challenges of getting the sector to think strategically together on occasion on the same issues and bringing people together to talk about it. And Dr. Stern mentions that we can't keep doing the same thing to get the same result. So how do we work together to solve some of those key issues, and how do we bring the different sectors together? Some of you have already indicated that you're not sure, but I think it is important to try to bring the sectors together to try to have some solutions for the issues that you've identified, and so how do we organize our work differently? And I'll add to that the comment from Dr. Common in terms of diversity being a strength, which is something that you've mentioned. So how do we achieve the diversity within our leadership in the agricultural innovation in order to address some of the key issues? And maybe that's part of the answer in terms of not getting the same results if we do the same things. Can you try to comment on this? And I'm going to start by you, Art, and then after that, Ted and yourself, Gerry.
Okay, that's a big question.
It is.
Honestly, I don't have an answer as to how we bring all of the agricultural sectors together into one unified voice. I really don't know how you do that. There's been many attempts have been made, and I think some of them had some marginal success. But we still have, too many regional differences, too many sectoral differences, too many commodity differences for that to happen. And I don't know how one resolves that. The one comment I would make is that this has to be a national initiative. It cannot be 10 provinces and 2 territories all having their own kind of ideas as to how they should work. And that in itself is going to be a huge issue because provinces don't tend to get along in general, east and west. So I think that's going to be the biggest dilemma. Different sectors view themselves differently. I don't know that I have an answer. In terms of the diversity, we are seeing a fair bit more diversity now in agriculture and food. I talked about the food manufacturing business and the new Canadians, many of which are not white, many of which are not speaking English, are developing some amazing products and some amazing companies. So we're getting that diversity in, and we're adjusting. I look at my kids now who are in their mid-40s, and you look through their refrigerators, and they've got a whole cohort of different foods in their refrigerators that I wouldn't have ever expected to have in ours. And we're starting to eat that now. So that's diversity. The other thing that's happening is the female diversity, the women in agriculture diversity is really taking a hold. We're seeing more women in positions of on boards, on company management positions, association organizations. And I think that's a very, very good thing. I know I'm not so sure I believe 100% that there should be mandated percentages, but I do believe we have to significantly move more to having more women involved in agriculture in a more senior and responsible positions. And I think that is happening. So I like that diversity very much. So we are making some progress. I would suspect not as much as people would like us to see, but I know, and if you go to the developing world now, and I think Ted would agree with this, you want something done, you get a group of women together, and guess what? They'll get it done. They will. You know, in Peru, if you provide a group of women cell phones, within 24 hours, they've got to stand beside the road and they've got a business set up, selling telephone calls. You know, it's just, I mean, they just have this innate entrepreneurial spirit about them that I think we've underestimated women having in North America or in Canada and in agriculture. So
I appreciate that. Ted?
I don't think I can add a lot to this other than one thought that when I, or two things really. One is that from one of the webinars that Cappy had recently, when we looked at the issue of diversity across the country, in a sense that we had very different regulatory systems running in each province, and foreign investor coming into that. The one that we highlighted, of course, was the new pea operation in Manitoba that is so important, $600 million investment. And the frustration that those people have gone through trying to build that investment with different provincial regulations regarding what, everything from the engineers they hire and their building codes, and to essentially the approval by CFIA of their products, which are well accepted in Europe and have been for years. It's so that's the one side of it. In a sense, I'm arguing there that we've got to have more standardization across this country if we're going to ever be able to develop the scale that's going to attract more foreign investment. The second piece of that, though, is using the same example. We do have a little bit different kind of agriculture running in Canada than in the U.S. Whereas the U.S., it's pretty rare to find people, running around planting a lot of pulses and other what the U.S. sees as somewhat niche crops. Whereas that's what goes on in Canada, because the other side of that border, there is so much essentially farm support, indirect subsidies, and they make no bones about it. And the OECD shows it every year in their presentations that Canada is among the lowest in terms of those subsidies. But we're up against, if you think about it, how this plays out, we're up against, I think the World Bank quoted just a while ago, saying there was $600 billion a year is in government support going into agriculture across the globe each year. And so we're swamped with that kind of stuff. And then we come to a country like Canada, which is divided up into provincial regimes, all competing for, as somebody said earlier, a plant and a faculty doing this, working on the same things as everybody else. So somehow we have to begin to pull this together into a more modular approach. If we're not going to be scale agriculture in corn and soybeans like the U.S. is, but we want to thrive in a great diversity of different crops, then let's figure out at least how we do that so that we can use the Canadian, the whole of Canada as a one market, one system with one set of regs, so that at least whether you're a domestic or a foreign investor, you're not faced with the problem of scaling, because that is a key issue, and it goes right back to how do we go about tackling these grand challenges? Well, if we're all little guys running around doing this, stuff on our own, it'll never get done.
Agreed. AIC held a meeting with some large companies a couple of weeks ago, I think, and we heard the message loud and clear from a number of them. They're tired of the divisions in the sector. They're tired of the multiplicity of centers and the way the services are duplicated within the provinces, and regulations are different from one to another. And I think that message is starting to resonate more and more on that front. And that may be one of the issues that's facing us post-COVID. Gerry, short response on that issue.
Well, part of the problem that we face is our location in the world. We get one crop a year, other than under glass and so on like that, where southern states and other locations are constantly putting more crops in the ground. So with us, it's very important, the cropping rotations that we work with. So we do end up, as Ted said, with a multiplicity of different crops grown, almost considered niche markets, but now they're global in scope. We're the largest producers in the world of pulse crops, of durum, of certain other crops, simply because of the amount of acres that we have available to us. Part of the problem is everybody thinks of these problems through a size and scope, and everything has to think big, where it's the details of some of these issues that will actually start to break them down into bite-sized chunks and start to find solutions. I'm buoyed by the fact that Art made the comment about all the women going into agriculture. That's fantastic. I'm very fortunate in my own family to have some very strong women that are involved, but you look at the quality and depth of education now on the farm. When my dad started farming, the average education was grade 8, maybe grade 10. When I started, it was grade 12, plus maybe a course in mechanics or welding or something like that, practical stuff. And now, like my nephew that's covering the ground, he's got 4 years of agriculture and then a whole bunch of other courses beyond that. And he's looking at micronutrients and so on, things that we didn't even think about or talk about. Where we over fertilized, he puts very little on and then starts to top dress with these micronutrients. So there's a huge shift happening right now that we have to embrace and have to support. I think we're just beginning. We're reinventing agriculture, and we get a chance to get it right about every generation.
There we go. So hopefully we're in the right side of the generation where we're going to get it right again. Just a couple of concluding statements. We're getting to the end of this, and I want to thank everyone. Dr. Buzzer came back and as a quick follow-up to Art and asked the question whether or not we should bring back the National Center of Excellence program. That's certainly a good idea, probably, that we would need to think about that. In terms of the food wastage, Mike Say from Genome Prairie did mention maybe for at least the food wastage originating from the kitchen, maybe we could develop an app for that. And in terms of a more robust inventory management and control system at a household level. And if I look at my fridge, I probably would buy such an app because it's certainly needed on that front. I want to thank everyone of our panelists for attending this. I really do appreciate all of your time, and I do appreciate the attendees as well. We had a number of very good questions. Our next webinar will be on April 18th, and will be a number of panelists from international organizations and dealing with climate change and ag, some of the innovation on that. But in the meantime, thank you everyone, and this has been a really good discussion. The intent for AIC, the Agri-Food Innovation Council, was to look at some of the things that have been done in the past and some of the key leaders, and we had 3 of them here for the sector to provide their thoughts on where we need to go from here. And I think we've achieved some of that. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Thank you, Ted, Art, and Gerry. Thank you. Bye-bye.